Today we're going to change things up a little bit, and instead of looking at an event or an empire or the life of an influential person, we're going to look at the way that the classical empires we've studied so far were interconnected through a network of trade routes, specifically the network of roads called the Silk Roads. Today's lesson also is going to raise a question about what causes history to happen, what causes things to change. Often our focus is drawn to those big events and those famous people, but it's also true that big structures like trade networks, slowly but surely, change history just as much as people do, especially by creating spaces where people from different cultures can interact. This is one of those lessons that follows a pattern as well. So if you learn the general pattern of what happens when people trade long distance, you'll have an easier time learning about every case of every trade network we're going to cover in world history class. So generally speaking, aside from material goods, trade routes spread technologies from one place to another. Resources and raw materials like iron or gold, ideas like religions, scientific ideas, rationalism, or otherwise. Disease, plague is going to make an entrance in history pretty shortly here, and generally just different cultures, different ways of knowing the world, different ways of being. I want you guys to ask yourself, as we continue through this course, how trade shapes history, and what shapes history more. Big structural behind the scenes things like trade that kind of set the parameters for how different civilizations interact, or the actions of a few important people. In addition to like the general diffusion of culture and technologies and ideas and disease, we can learn a separate pattern about long-distance trade in terms of what is required for it to work. Long-distance trade isn't present in all places and all times. In order for long-distance trade to work, you need certain conditions on the ground, namely political stability, because trade really, it's like moving from place to place while carrying a lot of things that are valuable, right? And that doesn't work super well if you're going to have to move through a war zone. If you have political stability, if you have strong states or empires, then you probably have the rule of law. Then there are probably penalties for theft and robbery and violence. And when empires protect trade, which it's in their advantage to do because trade brings money, then you have flourishing long-distance travel. These strong states and empires guarantee the safety of traders, and that makes it possible for each individual merchant to make the decision to embark upon a long-distance journey. Otherwise, the risk of going forth alone into the wilderness with valuables isn't exactly worth it. So those are the general patterns. I have another pattern for you, and over the next several units, I hope that you will be able to kind of piece together an answer to this general riddle. We study a number of civilizations that experience golden ages in history in this class. We've already learned about Athens and the Pax Romana, and coming up next, we're going to learn about the Arab Empire, the Mongol Empire, Renaissance Europe. And each and every one of these civilizations that has one of these time periods of progress and peace and prosperity, a golden age, engages in long-distance trade. In contrast, cultures that experience what are called dark ages in history tend to be isolated from long-distance trade networks. So think about why, what the connection might be. Today, we're going to look at the specific case of the Silk Road trade networks, which wasn't actually a road and it wasn't made of silk, obviously. Instead, it was a collection of trade routes through Central Asia, from China all the way to the Mediterranean. Really, though, it was two separate routes that kind of joined in the middle. The first one would have been from the Eastern Mediterranean to Central Asia, so from like Greece, roughly, through the Middle East to Central Asia, and then the second from Central Asia to China and beyond. Additionally, there were water routes in the Mediterranean, which connected the Middle East to the Mediterranean and Rome in the classical era, and also through the Pacific connecting Japan, and then in the Indian Ocean connecting India to Africa. Rome and the Han Dynasty in the classical period were really, really, really far away from each other, right? They were too far to interact directly, but these two classical civilizations did have some interaction through the Silk Road trade network, which is actually pretty incredible when you consider the geography of Central Asia, the place that the merchants would have had to cross in order to make this happen. Central Asia is dominated by big desert and big mountains. Normally, these are topographical features that make communication really difficult, but not impossible, as we shall see. One thing that made this kind of travel possible were these spots in the desert where water can be found. A place like this is called an oasis. These spots were pretty critical because living things need water, right? So like you need to be able to water your camels. You would be thirsty too. And they were places where you could stop, rest, and then continue on your journey. The thing about Central Asia, though, is not only is it difficult to travel because of deserts and mountains, but the land itself is difficult to cultivate. It's actually almost impossible to. If you look at this biome map of Central Asia, you'll notice it's dominated by desert, grass and shrubs, a steppe. These are not exactly lands where you can settle down and grow food in the traditional agricultural farming way, right? So this is land that is dominated especially by pastoral nomads. If you remember back to previous units, pastoral nomads are people who move around from place to place with domesticated pack animals. And they move because their animals need to feed on the sparse grass that's there, but then they eat it all, so they have to keep moving. These nomads are critical for making the Silk Road trade possible because, by definition, they're really good at moving around in difficult landscapes, and also they mostly already lived there. Being able to move around in difficult landscapes with pack animals, right, like the hallmark traits of pastoral nomads, are exactly what you need for trade to work. So, together with the existence of the occasional oasis town in the desert, the skills of these pastoral nomads made the Silk Road trade possible and really provided a critical link between these classical civilizations that, you know, some of which would have been way too far apart for any interaction whatsoever. These nomads would not have traveled the entire Silk Road from one end to the next. That would have been pretty much impossible during this time period. I mean, not impossible, but like really hard, right? A guy named Marco Polo manages it later. That's a story for another time. Instead, the typical idea was like you'd start in one region and move goods like partial way through the Silk Roads. And then the next merchant would pick up the trail and keep things moving, marking up the price every time, of course. This meant that the Silk Roads weren't all just one thing. It wasn't just like desert with people walking through it. Instead, little trade cities would develop, and these trade cities developed a character of their own. Starting in China, for example, you could start with silk, porcelain, paper, iron, medicine, herbs, tea, and then like later on in history, gunpowder and printing. And those goods would move their way east, west, 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 west. China's in the east. They would move west. Eventually, they'd get to a city that kind of creates a fork in the road. And that city would have been sort of a melting pot where merchants from Central Asia and East Asia would kind of meet and exchange goods further. And there were a lot of these little cities along the path. Some of them were specialized in specific goods like jade and Buddhist text. Others were celebrated for being oasis towns, and like different civilizations and nomads actually would compete for these places because they became critical to the ability of merchants to go even further. In the south, you'd get India, which kind of worked as a middleman because from India you could move goods along the water, but also through the north, rejoin the overland Silk Road. And then all the way in the west, when you're getting closer to the Mediterranean, you get the famous city of Palermo, which is in modern day Syria. And then even further west than that, Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul, which was the link between the East and West. And it was a critically important city because precisely of its location kind of as like a door hinge between Central Asia and Europe. Became super rich for it. Along these trade routes, all kinds of things were exchanged, some legal, some illegal. Some of them were actual goods like medicine, tea, dried fruit, peacocks, pack animals. Other things were not so tangible. Buddhism, especially, traveled along these paths and spread almost like it were a physical thing that you could buy or sell through the merchants who would pass, stop off in these cities and eventually maybe stop off in a monastery, talk to Buddhist monks, etc. So Buddhism spread from India east along these Silk Roads. Another thing that spreads along roads like this, especially once they become more interconnected, is disease. And that's going to make an entrance in history pretty soon here with the plague and the Black Death. We'll get there in a bit. So Silk Road trade kind of raises the centrality of pastoral nomads in Central Asia to history. And here's where it kind of gets really interesting, because if you'll remember, it's really hard for nomadic cultures to create written records that end up in history books, partially because they're always on the move. And yet, they are critical to making history in ways that sometimes are visible, sometimes not so visible. Crucially, nomads and civilizations interacted with each other a lot more than meets the eye. If we remember, like when cities became civilizations, people in these settled towns began to look down on people outside their borders, kind of like barbarians, as people who were like, savages, less than. They looked down on these people. And yet, settled civilizations relied on these nomads for trade. Traders and camel drivers were the bridges between nomadic cultures and cities, and as they moved, ideas and goods and resources and disease moved too. When civilizations and nomads got along, it was usually out of like positive trading relations like this. However, settled civilizations and nomads often clashed as well. Sometimes it had to do with settled civilizations like expanding into nomadic territory. Sometimes it had to do with nomads staging raids on outlying farms or in fortified settlements of the civilizations. Sometimes these were like minor skirmishes. Other times, however, entire empires would fall. It's kind of fascinating, too, how this group of people who you'd think would be way less powerful than these big, strong empires with all their fancy armies could actually win these battles. But those settled people had usually thick walls protecting them and heavy armor on their side. The nomads tended to benefit from having very little to lose and having the skills of a nomad, being really fast on a horse and not being so rigid in your thinking about military strategy. And we're going to see this happen a lot in history. Pretty soon, we're going to talk about the collapse of the Han Dynasty in China And that collapse had a lot to do with just centuries of being weakened with conflict with nomads at the border. We're also going to see the fall of the Roman Empire in dramatic fashion as literal invasions weaken and then eventually topple the empire. And then later on in history, we get to see even more examples of this. The founder of Islam, Muhammad, was himself a trader, a nomad who, was engaged in trade before he established his religion. And then he established an empire of his own, a big fancy one. It had a golden age. It was amazing. We'll also see the rise of the Mongols, a tribe from Central Asia that, through incredible determination and ferocity, but also a pretty wise system of rule, ended up building the largest land empire to that date in history. So, long story short, sometimes nomads in Central Asia interact with civilizations in a way that benefits them both. Trading is a great example of that. Sometimes they clash, and when they clash, sometimes history changes. For now, though, we're just focused on the Silk Roads, right? The trade part of this story. We will get to the conflict part of the story when we look at the collapse of empires. Along the Silk Roads in Central Asia, silk passed from China west, and silk was an incredibly well-guarded state secret in China because it's a cloth that you can do a lot with. You can make like really strong fishing line with it. It makes really warm clothes for the winter and yet somehow cool fabric for the summer, and the Romans could not get enough of it. In addition to silk, jade, silver, iron, porcelain passed from China west. From the Roman end of things moving east, you'd have wool and gold and silver, but especially gold. And in fact, Romans started spending so much of their gold on silk that it began to cause them some pretty sizable economic problems. Africa was in on the game too. From Africa, ivory would diffuse. Arabia brought the Silk Roads a bunch of incense. And India, in addition to acting as kind of the middleman of the Silk Roads that like linked it to these water routes, diffused Buddhism and, actual goods like jade too. Remember that all of this occurred at a time when the fastest you could travel anywhere would be on a horse. So it is pretty fascinating that these interactions between these settled civilizations ever happened at all, given the landscape, given the difficulty of the terrain, and given the limitations of technology. And with that, we arrive at the note-taking portion of this class. So our key points summarize what you have already heard. For the Silk Roads, our focus is on cultural diffusion in the classical period. And the Silk Roads follow this general pattern of strong empires creating the safety and stability necessary for long-distance trade and cultural diffusion to take place. The Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Han Dynasty, and in India, the Gupta Empire were strong and stable enough to keep roads safe, which let merchants travel safely through their lands, which caused long-distance trade and cultural diffusion to flourish in the classical era. Even though they were separated by great distances, these classical empires were connected through a collection of overland trade routes called the Silk Roads. It was named the Silk Roads because of silk from China that traveled as far west as the Roman Empire. And these routes connected South Asia, East Asia, and the Middle East in a giant network of exchange, while water trade routes in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean extended their reach even further, bringing Europe and Southeast Asia and Africa into the mix. Pastoral nomads from Central Asia are key to this kind of overland trade because of the rough terrain. And though they didn't necessarily travel the whole span of the Silk Roads, they would carry goods shorter distances along those paths, allowing those goods to travel from China to Rome, which would have been way too far apart for them to have direct interactions otherwise. This is a great example of cultural diffusion. right? So like aside from trade, ideas, disease, and technology traveled these roads. And the specific example for ideas that makes a huge historical difference for this time period is Buddhism. Buddhist missionaries traveled along the Silk Roads, spreading those ideas from India to China, establishing stopovers for travelers and missionary bases in the process. Next time, we'll pick up the story with the conflict piece. So, aside from facilitating trade and, in times of peace, getting along reasonably well with settled empires, these Central Asian nomads are going to have a pretty big and dramatic impact on history when they start to cause the decline and fall of these classical civilizations.